Now, I'd like to introduce our speakers, a part of this roundtable discussion. Any information that we give you all will be qualitative. It will be the quality of these stories that we are providing, these testimonies of people who have personally experienced the woes of the childcare system and the needs that we have in our community. So without further ado, I'd first like to welcome Nellie Medina from Neighbor to Neighbor. She is going to speak to us today to the question of, as a parent or caregiver, how has cost and limits to access impacted you and your family? Welcome, Nellie.
Everyone, thank you for having, thank you, Bree, Latoya, and all the organizers for this event. I prepared a little speech I want to go into before I talk, just because it's very emotional for me. So where I live in Worcester, the high cost of childcare exacerbates socioeconomic and racial and ethnic inequalities. At the same time, in regions across Massachusetts, families with young children like myself are spending more on childcare than housing, food, or healthcare. Unfortunately, on average, the early care and education setting attended by many young children, particularly in low-income children and BIPOC, provide quality at levels too low to adequately promote children's learning and development. First-generation graduates like me from underserved communities pay too much for reliable care, childcare. Parents and caregivers throughout my inner city community have struggled to find affordable healthcare arrangements. For example, as a single mother making $200 over the assessed poverty line, I do not qualify for affordable childcare. The cost would overwhelm and plunge my son and I into deep poverty. Therefore, my immunocompromised son on the autism spectrum is homeschooled as I work 40 hours a week, which means he has little social interaction. Now I have to decide between making a future for my son and I, moving out of subsidized housing, and leaving my job to afford quality childcare. The Common Start bill would provide assistance to people of nearly all income levels, making childcare truly affordable no matter how much money a family makes. It would ensure that families, caretakers, and single parents caring for children with disabilities have the resources they need to ensure consistent access to high quality early education and childcare, which will assist families like mine whose success or lack thereof is connected to access to affordable childcare for their children. So what I'm seeing here is that there's not enough childcare. A lot of the families that I work with and who are around me have children that attend school half days, so they don't qualify for healthcare. I remember dropping off my son to school nervous because I didn't have the money that day to pay for the sitter. I paid 30% of my income on subsidized housing, another 20% on transportation, and another 30%. And I was making $12,000 a year as a full-time student. And so I think that poverty is directly impacted by childcare. If I had reliable and safe childcare for my immunocompromised and special needs child, we'd be living a different life right now. This bill is so important, and I know it's not going to be for me. I know it might take some time to get passed, but I'm going to advocate as hard as I can on behalf of the Parents Union of Massachusetts and myself as a mom, because these hardships stay with you forever, and it doesn't have to be this hard. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nellie, for sharing your story with us. And now I'd like to introduce our second speaker, which will be Dorothy Williams, who will speak to us about, as an early educator, what needs to be done to support your critical work.
Thank you so much, Bree. I appreciate the opportunity to speak this evening. I'm going to share a different light on the subject from the former speaker, as I am a family child care provider in the Dorchester area for the past 14 years. And since the pandemic, things have actually been very difficult based on the fact that I have more part-time children than I've ever had. So therefore, meeting my break-even point on a monthly basis has proved to be challenging. I've found now that I've had to diversify the children that I provide care for. At one point in time, I was 100% voucher, but based on the rate that you receive from a voucher, it's not sustainable. So therefore, I have found myself in a situation where I've had to bring on private children in order to sustain my business. Not to say that they don't need the service, why, of course they do. But because I live in the Dorchester area, I would prefer to provide services for my at-risk community. I feel as though that if we were given a rate that is suitable and based on a living wage, then you would find more providers willing to take on voucher children. And you would find more providers who would be willing to stay in the business. I can share with you several people are leaving based on the fact that we do not have benefits. We work long hours, and we find ourselves, especially after a child reaches the age of 2, that the funding source is decreased. But yet, if I was in another part of the Massachusetts area, my daily hourly rate based on the voucher system would be very high. It would not be the rate that we currently receive in my area, which is called Region 6. So it would be very helpful if people would take a good hard look at that, because in the end, this is about sustainability, which right now equals to financial strength and running a business. Yes, I may be in my home, but because I have a staff member, I'm responsible for payroll, I'm responsible for insurance, I'm responsible for making sure I keep my staff. Continuity of care is extremely important when you're dealing with children. And I would not like to have my staff rotate because I'm not able to pay them. Yes, people have talked about giving people an increase, but how do you sustain that increase? A bonus here and there is nice, but it may not necessarily keep people under your employer. So I just want to make sure that long term, we all take a good hard look at what Common Start is proposing, because again, it's going to impact our community, which is going to impact our children and our future.
Thank you so much, Dorothy, for coming and sharing your story with us. Next, I'd like to introduce our third speaker, who will answer to the question of, as a provider, what problems did you face prior to versus during the pandemic? Please welcome Sheila Henry of SEIU 509.
Hello, how are you? Hi, everybody. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you. Welcome.
Okay. Welcome. Listen, well, in the beginning, the problems that I kind of dealt with was sort of like the young lady that just got off. I just feel personally that, we're taking in kids for 10-hour days and we're not being reimbursed enough. A lot of my own money I used to use for like different things for the children, whether it be buying the kids a coat or just doing things because that mom was paying me and trying to meet ends at home. And so I feel like, we need to have more pay for the providers. We need to have better benefits for the parents or better voucher system to work with the parents and the money that they get in. That was prior to the pandemic. But now that the pandemic is here, there are no fundings for vouchers, and we're still fighting for increase for the providers. It's horrible when you think about all the love and all the love and the support you give to not only the children, but to their families. So I'd like to just see us get better wages and fight for vouchers for parents that truly need it.
Thank you so much, Sheila, for coming and sharing your perspective with us. Our last and final speaker is Maria Moeller, who will speak to, as an agency provider, what problems did you face prior to versus during the pandemic?
Thank you, Bree. So I like Bree said, I'm Maria Muller, and I am CEO of the community group in Lawrence, which is a BIPOC community. I think I want to focus on access and share a little bit of our story in Lawrence to hopefully highlight what could possibly happen at the state level and some of the possibilities for our field. As an agency in a BIPOC community in Lawrence and a provider, we had to navigate the system as much as our families did in order for families to access childcare services and to make sure that we got them the help they were looking for when they walked through our doors. And access was already an issue prior to the pandemic. Anybody that is a provider here or works in childcare is aware of that. And it's an issue for both providers and especially for families, obviously, because they are the ones in need of childcare, and childcare is, again, a foundational need for families in order to survive. During the pandemic, obviously, this became a much worse issue, especially in communities like Lawrence, because many of our families didn't have the option to work remotely. They needed childcare, whether or not there was a pandemic here, and our programs remained open. So, most of our families working at essential workers were able to access childcare services with the flexibilities that the state allowed at that point. But then as things started reopening and students went to remote learning, families started facing some access issues into childcare. They couldn't access childcare vouchers for for one reason or another, the same issues that they have right now to access subsidies. And that triggered also families to start, specifically in Lawrence, there was a case where families were placing children in unlicensed care, which is very unsafe for them. And obviously it was an unsafe situation. So we partnered with the city in a true spirit of collaboration and developed a city childcare voucher, taking into consideration the specific needs of our community. And this is what I want to highlight here. Every community has different needs, and it was really nice to be able to develop something that our families could use and truly get help from. So we partnered with the city. Again, we developed childcare vouchers. We eliminated what the barriers we perceived as most important from keeping our families from accessing childcare. And there were some revealing findings that we could learn from. I mean, currently we have 289 children placed in childcare through these vouchers. That surprisingly, these families, over half of 50% of them were eligible for state subsidies, but somehow we're not able to access it, right? Because of technology barriers, language barriers, paperwork, bureaucratic barriers. And we eliminated those. Those families were able to access vouchers. We allowed access to families within the cliff as well. So those families were able to make more money and maybe earn more, because again, many of them are being paid a little more per hour, and still be eligible for vouchers, so they can still progress, get some progress or move forward. And most of the adjustments that we made in this program were equity related, because again, they removed the barriers that only our families face, not necessarily every family. So I think we have a little bit to learn at the state level, and we can definitely, there are ways to, at the community level, you're understanding the needs of our communities. There are ways to remove some of those, and we have to be very much dig deep in the regulation to see where those are, to make a big difference for our families. Because again, lack of access to childcare for our families at that point meant lack of employment, which meant lack of food, which meant many bad things, especially during the pandemic.
Thank you so much, Maria, for sharing your story with us as well. So now we will begin to come into a spotlighted portion where we will tie the pieces of these testimonies together to how racial equity impacts these issues raised. So next, I'd like to highlight Edna Cubillos and allow her to tell her story, and then everyone else will talk specifically to how the issues they raise tie into racial equity. Welcome, Edna. You can go ahead.
Buenas noches. Mi nombre es Edna, vivo en Worcester, soy educadora de cuidado infantil familiar por 6 años y estoy muy contenta de estar con todos ustedes y vengo a abogar por desarrollo profesional en nuestro idioma. Nosotros trabajamos con niños de diferentes razas, nacionalidades, culturas e idiomas. Y la forma en que venimos a este país, todas las personas, es muy diferente. Hay gente que llega muy joven, hay gente que llega de mediana edad y hay gente que llega con una edad más avanzada. Y para todos tenemos dificultades con el inglés. Y si a eso se le suma que el desarrollo profesional no lo podemos coger en nuestro idioma, dificulta las cosas. Todo esto para decir que sería... para mí como hispana y somos un gremio muy grande en el Family Child Care, conseguir desarrollo profesional, porque esto se ve reflejado en la comunidad y en todas nuestras familias. El hecho de que nosotros nos podamos profesionalizar y que tengamos una mejor calidad de cuidado infantil en los niños, eso lo va a reflejar en los niños, en las familias y por ende en nuestra comunidad. Muchas gracias.
Gracias, Edna. So next we will spotlight all of the wonderful speakers that you heard tonight, and we will allow them to answer to the question of how does racial equity tie into these issues?
Okay, well, I can go. Am I unmuted?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
Yeah, so I'd like to say one, as the Western Mass chapter coordinator for the Common Start Coalition, one of the things that, started to come to light when you're talking to families, doing outreach, and really trying to get families to understand. So families realize that there's an issue. They realize, okay, I've signed up, like I'm on this wait list, I'm waiting for access to care, or once I have access to care, this voucher is supposed to subsidize the child care that I need, but yet I'm still having barriers even with the parent fee. But families may not have immediately realized what it was or some of the barriers that was actually impacting or the system behind some of the challenges that they were facing. So one of the things I want to say is that the coalition has been really helpful in educating families on, yes, you're facing these barriers, but let us explain why. And these are also the same families who are coming from, of course, marginalized communities, get their same services in the same marginalized communities that they come from, and may not even realize that their childcare providers are facing some of the same issues that they are facing, and yet they're giving even more and more of themselves to the families. Like Sheila's story that she told really resonated. During my time as the family childcare coordinator for 509, I would hear a lot of stories about how family childcare providers were overextending themselves at times when they may not have had the resources totally for their families, but they were making sure to secure that for the other families. It's causing an issue, racially, because when we look at Black women, especially in the workforce, and their attempt to try to tap into industries that they may not normally operate in. When we talk about things like the building trades or, certain truck driving or, certain STEM areas. And when you have a lack of access to childcare so that you can't get to your college course, or so that you can't get to that non-standard hour work shift, those early morning starts, or maybe that second shift work to get the overtime, it really puts an impact and it widens the racial equity gap that the families, that need the service the most are facing.
Thank you so much, Janae. Would anyone else like to jump in to speak directly to how their testimony relates to racial equity in childcare?
Yes, I'd like to speak on this because I, again, have found myself in a situation where I no longer care for the children who are on vouchers in terms of my numbers. I've had to reduce my numbers. I am now only at 30%, where at one point in time in the history of my business, I was at 100%. And that's because I can no longer afford to care for the voucher children and maintain staff. If I did that, I would have to reduce my numbers from 10 to 6 in order to stay in business. And so you have to take a hard look at that. I mean, I'm dealing with parents who, because of the location I'm at, work for the hospitals, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're a nurse or they're a physician. They may have jobs where, they may not be on, they may be entry-level positions, and therefore their salary may not necessarily be able to cover, and they have the vouchers. And so what are you supposed to do? I still need to turn the lights on. I still need to have a phone. I still need to pay, my mortgage. So it's a catch-22 because I want to provide services for my community, but yet I find myself again, because of the bias and because of the lack of funding that's associated with this, you have to make a hardcore decision. I don't, from my own personal business ethics, no, this is not the original idea, but unfortunately, this is what has become based on economics.
Thank you.
I just want to touch on that a little bit more about what Dorothy said, because we saw this exacerbated during the pandemic, where when you're talking about those frontline workers that work in those essential industries, they did not have the opportunity to work from home. And right where there were some families, even like myself, where I had the opportunity to work from home. And so I could have my children with me and still maintain my job. When these same families are also the families that are people of color in these frontline positions that cannot afford to work from home, but don't have equitable access to childcare, that threatens the sustainability of their children. On the other side, when you look at, especially, again, you notice I'm going to make reference to family childcare because that's where a lot of my professional background comes from on this matter. But family childcare providers were so amiable during the pandemic, and they were the ones expanding their programs so that they could provide that all-day care, expanding some of those children who were usually either before or after school, and they had to provide all-day care for them, right? And so now you have these licensed professionals who just only 10 years ago were really viewed by society as just babysitters. And primarily we're talking primarily women of color, and a substantial amount of them are Black women. And so just making sure that we elevate their status within the education system, because we need to make sure we remember the important role that they play in the economy of our state, and especially for uplifting the wages and employment for people of color.
And you're absolutely right. I want to touch on that as well, because I was an emergency family child care provider during the pandemic. And yes, indeed, I had to provide services for children that were not in my particular expertise. I deal with preschoolers, and I ended up having the majority of my kids were school age. And so you have to adjust your curriculum. You have to, get ready and get prepared. And I did that during, the duration. And, it was challenging, but it was, a learning curve, of course, but we did it. And you're absolutely right. It is women of color. I mean, this is, unfortunately, this profession has always been looked upon as, how can I put it, second class. I mean, because you're not a center. All right. So they feel as though that family child care, all you're doing is sitting a child in front of a TV all day long. No, we have curriculums. We have activities. We take them on field trips. We do the exact same thing. We feed them. We do all the things that they would do if they were in a center and more. with love and kindness and smaller numbers, which made them safer, believe it or not, during the pandemic, because most parents didn't want their children to be in a large group setting because of this. So, you know, and whether you have a degree or not, I mean, I have my master's degree, and all I can say to you is that the people are so uninformed in terms of what we do and how we do it, that it's mind-boggling to me. Because again, the stigma is that we're sitting children in front of a TV. No, we are not. And
Yes.
that needs to be
Can
balanced.
Bree, can I jump in if you don't mind, Bree?
Yes, please.
So I just wanted to also just kind of jump in and share. I thank all the providers and all the caregivers that have already spoken, but can we talk about the disenfranchised women that we have within the workforce? Those women that do have jobs, still need childcare, cannot get a voucher, and have to come out of pocket, and with the low income and all the wraparound early ed childcare education that we're talking about. We have to talk about it from all perspectives, not just from the provider's perspective and from those that services and so on, but we have to look at it from the mama's point of view, because the moms are the foundation of the family, you know. And when you go out into the workforce, for say example, my story, my daughter has a good job. It's not a high paying job, but it's a good job. You know, she still had rent, she had all of that. During the pandemic, she experienced something that I don't think that women should ever experience. My granddaughter was about 2 years old or so when we did the lockdown and the shutdown, and she had to continue to pay her care provider for her child while she couldn't take her to the facility, right? So she was still paying it. And then about maybe 4 months in, 5 months in, it was like, you know, I'm gonna have to stop paying, because now she's in the house more. There's more groceries having to be bought, more because you're not going out to work, you're not going out, you know, so you're doing more bill creation now that you're working from home, but you still have to provide to pay for the slot. So when she stopped paying for the slot, she lost that slot, you know, and was not able to get the slot back because she couldn't pay for the slot anymore, because she had to balance the difference. So we have to look at what Common Start is about. Common Start is about complete wraparound early ed, child care, caregiving. We got to look at it from all perspectives. And that's one of the reasons why the Massachusetts Commission, when we did our child care hearing, we heard so much from the mamas, from all diverse communities, disenfranchised, low income, because you got to think about disenfranchised and low income are in different levels. You know what I'm saying? So I want to say that we have to mention that. I have to mention that not all of the mothers that can't get the vouchers are able to smoothly go through this. They are having the struggles and they're having issues just as the disenfranchised communities are, you know, because we're still all disenfranchised, because we know race and equity is not across the board for everyone, you know. So if you have a good job, you still might not be getting paid to the right wage that you should be paid to be able to accomplish what you need to do for your family. So I just needed to mention that before we go any further. All right, thank you, Bree.
No problem. Thank you so much, Meredith.
Yeah, I just wanted to point
Yes.
out that over in the first 8 months of the pandemic, 75,000 moms left the workforce and 70% were BIPOC. And so that's what we're dealing with. We're dealing with moms who had to leave the workforce, which is really devastating. Another thing that happened, which is about information and race, is that a lot of the moms were uninformed. They didn't know that they can furlough for a year, that they didn't have to take their immunocompromised children out of the house, and they lost their spots. I found out later that I could have kept it because I felt that my son wasn't safe. And so I think that we have to make sure that agencies that are distributing these vouchers have emotional intelligence and understand that we are not all informed and that we're all operating on different levels. Like I said, because I say I'm $200 above, it doesn't mean that I'm in a great place. It means that if I take my son to childcare, if I pay these high costs, that we will be back in poverty. And so a lot of the moms that I work with, they say they'd rather not work because it costs too much. And so that's the cliff effect. And that's how they keep us in poverty. So we do need this hurdle. We need to overcome this hurdle so that this is not an issue, so that we can get to the next step. But for moms who don't maybe have the education or don't have the knowledge or are afraid of the system or from another country, the cliff effect is real. And I think we have to educate parents and educators and agencies about this. Otherwise, we're going to get nowhere. I mean, childcare is great, but if you're going nowhere and there's no end product, then you're just spending your money and you're going in circles. And so we need to help parents with that.
I would say that the current system, and thank you, Meredith, because the whole field needs some restructuring and some system changes, so systemic change in order for providers and families to benefit from it. I think they both need a great amount of support, but it's very uncomfortable, and I'm speaking as an agency and a provider also, but it's just very uncomfortable when parents come in as trying to access childcare, and the regulations basically are developed based on the assumption that it's a fraud, and to be perfectly blunt, and it just feels very uncomfortable to treat parents that way versus taking the approach of like, how can we help you? How can we make sure that we get that access? What are the flexibilities that we can apply here that will get you what you need in order to be successful and have feed your family, something as basic as that. So I think we need to refocus, how we develop regulations and eligibility versus just trying to make a list of things that you need to provide, in order to make sure that you're not stealing money, because I just find that insulting.
Agreed. Thank you all.